Hello, welcome to week 2 of Principles of Regulatory Law. This week will be focused on statutory interpretation. In Unit 1, we're going to talk about different statutory interpretation canons. I'll give you first a brief overview of the different sources of meaning we'll be going over. First, there are intrinsic sources, which are sources within the statute, including the language of the statute, the structure of the statute. Then we also have extrinsic sources, which are outside of the statute, such as legislative history. Lastly, we have policy-based canons, which are tools of interpretation based simply on policy. So I'll review briefly some of the sources included in each of these categories. For intrinsic sources, our starting point is always the words or text of the statute. We also look at grammar and punctuation, the components of the statute, such as the purpose clause, the titles, or the definitions section, and different linguistic canons that we're going to talk about in much more detail. For extrinsic sources, we can consider earlier drafts of the bill, legislative history, statutory purpose outside of the statute, so derived, for example, from legislative history, legislative silence in response to a judicial interpretation, and the interpretations of other jurisdictions and agencies. For policy-based canons, we'll discuss the rule of lenity, derogation from common law, retroactivity, and the doctrine of constitutional avoidance. So let's get started with intrinsic sources, the words of the statute itself. So how do we define what the words in a statute mean? Well, the primary source would be any statutory definitions. So this would be the definitions that Congress has provided us to interpret the statute. Those are controlling even if they may conflict with the ordinary meaning, what a reasonable person would understand, or a dictionary definition. If there's no statutory definition, then we would look at ordinary meaning or plain meaning, which is a reasonable person's understanding of the term. One way to figure that out would be from a dictionary definition. There are also technical definitions, which, as we'll see, are for special technical contexts, and common law definitions, so definitions that derive from the common law. The plain meaning rule is the foundation of statutory interpretation, and that says that words in a statute generally have their plain or ordinary meaning. Ordinary meaning refers to the meaning of a word that a reasonable person would think upon hearing the word. And how does a judge find that ordinary meaning? It can be based on the judge's own understanding or through dictionaries. But there are many issues that come up with looking up definitions in a dictionary. Questions like, which dictionary do we use? Which time period? What about if a word has many dictionary definitions? There's a lot of subjective choice in picking the dictionary and the definition you want to follow. And dictionaries really don't take context into account. So those are all some of the troublesome issues with using a dictionary. Also, the definitional meaning may not be the ordinary meaning of the term. Then we have the technical meaning rule, and the technical meaning rule is an exception to the plain meaning rule. The technical meaning rule says that a word or a phrase that has acquired a technical or particular meaning in a certain context has that technical meaning if used in that context. So what's the difference between ordinary and technical meaning? Ordinary meaning is something a layperson would use, whereas technical meaning is the meaning that specialists in a certain field would use. And how do you determine which one applies? Well, you would look at whether the surrounding words are technical and whether the statute is actually directed at a technical audience. There are certain situations, though, when judges are going to look beyond the plain meaning of words. Even though that's the starting point for almost every judge, it's often not the end point. The main reason that judges look beyond plain meaning is because of ambiguity. If there's ambiguity about what a statute means based on the plain meaning, we're going to need to bring in other sources. Sometimes also there may not be ambiguity, but there may be an absurdity. The ordinary meaning might result in some type of absurd interpretation. In that situation too, a judge will look beyond the plain meaning of a word. Third, there could be a scrivener's error, which is basically a fancy term for a typo, right? If there's obviously some basic mistake in drafting, that could be a reason to look beyond plain meaning. And a fourth situation is where the ordinary meaning would raise some serious constitutional issues. If that's the situation, again, we could look beyond ordinary meaning. When we talk about ambiguity, which is one of the reasons to look beyond ordinary meaning, there are two kinds of ambiguity. One is lexical ambiguity, and the other structural ambiguity. So lexical ambiguity has to do with a word having multiple meanings, a word or a phrase. So for example, the old "who's on first" play is something that would be an example of lexical ambiguity. And textual context is often more helpful in resolving lexical ambiguity than structural ambiguity. Structural ambiguity, on the other hand, occurs when the underlying structure of the sentence, usually the grammar, is such that there's more than one interpretation possible based on that structure. So for example, the phrase "visiting relatives can be boring" could mean going to visit relatives is boring, or when relatives are visiting, that's boring. We'll look at a couple more examples to try to clarify this. And purpose is more helpful in resolving structural ambiguity compared to lexical ambiguity. So for example, look at this cartoon. We have Sherlock, we have two sort of captions. One is "Sherlock saw the man using binoculars." So as we can see from the photo, Sherlock is the one using binoculars and he's seeing the man using the binoculars. The other one, same caption, "Sherlock saw the man using binoculars." Here, Sherlock is seeing the man who is using binoculars. So is this lexical or structural ambiguity? This would be structural ambiguity because it's the structure of the sentence, or the sort of the grammatical ambiguity of the sentence, that creates the ambiguity. It's not that any one word or phrase is ambiguous in terms of its meaning. Here are a couple more examples. So on one side, we have a slide saying $1,000 fine for littering. This is an example of lexical ambiguity because it's unclear what the word "fine" means. Is this sign saying $1,000 is okay to litter as long as you're littering $1,000? Or is the fine the penalty, right, for littering? So, and $1,000 the amount of the penalty. Because the word "fine" is ambiguous, this is lexical ambiguity. On the other side here, we have a photo of a woman on the phone saying, "Oh, and I've started seeing a therapist." So does that mean she's dating a therapist, or does that mean she's actually seeing a therapist sitting on the bench next to her? Again, here we have an ambiguous word, and it's "seeing." And because it's that word that's ambiguous, this is lexical ambiguity rather than structural ambiguity. So what about absurdity, which is another exception to the plain meaning rule? What does absurdity mean? There's lots of different interpretations. One is something that conflicts with congressional intent. And another possible definition given by courts is a consequence so monstrous that all of mankind would without hesitation unite in rejecting the application. A third definition would be something shocking to one's conscience. There's really no agreed upon definition, but the key thing to remember is that absurdity is rarely invoked by the Supreme Court. So I think often students will more quickly reach the conclusion that something is absurd than a court would. It's actually quite rare. And that concludes section unit 1.1. We'll now move on to unit 1.2 on intrinsic sources or grammar. So the general rule is that grammar and punctuation matter unless the ordinary meaning suggests they should be ignored. This rule is a rebuttable presumption. So sometimes there is a reason for ignoring grammar. Take this example. It says, "A panda eats, shoots, and leaves." This is ambiguous, right? We have, because there's no comma in this phrase, this could mean the panda eats and then shoots with a gun and leaves the scene. Or it can mean that a panda eats, consumes, shoots, and leaves. Without a comma in the sentence, we don't really know which one is being said. Another grammatical issue is the use of "and" versus "or." Now, generally, "and" means both things, and "or" means either thing. But there are occasions when courts have interpreted "and" to mean "or" and "or" to mean "and." Usually, however, we would start by giving them their normal grammatical meaning. With respect to singular and plural, though, The presumption is that when Congress uses the singular, it means the plural and vice versa, that these aren't important distinctions. So we would normally construe one as including the other. Similarly, with masculine, feminine, and neuter, we would presume that one includes the other, unless there's some reason to think a statute is specifically referring to women or men. Just because Congress uses, say, a male pronoun, we would interpret it to apply to women as well. Mandatory versus discretionary language is also key in statutory interpretation. So words like shall, may, and must are important to pay attention to. Shall and must are normally construed as mandatory, whereas may is normally construed as discretionary. But there are also cases suggesting that what really matters is whether the statute provides a penalty for the failure to comply. So if it does provide a penalty, it's likely mandatory. And if it's not, then the term could be interpreted as discretionary, even if it says shall. So that concludes Unit 1.2. And next we'll be turning to linguistic canons.